I hope you've all enjoyed this day. And what I'm now going to do, if you like, is to give something which in a way draws on what you've heard so far, but also says something about where we are now, where we're going. Today, you've heard on the one hand about lots of new ideas and new challenges. Roger Bootle told you about the kind of challenges and prospects facing the UK with Brexit and the negotiating, quote, strategy, unquote, I think it's fair to say, of the current government. You heard from other people, Tom Standage, about the way driverless cars are going to change the economics of the way we incorporate the costs of externalities, change the whole way that the built environment is structured, probably. So you've heard all about new challenges, new ideas, new things that are happening. The last talk you just heard, Jamie, I think, spoke to what is increasingly becoming the big kind of political and intellectual debating topic of our time, the question of equality and inequality and what, if anything, we should do about it. But at the same time, you also heard about the value of old ideas, the continuing validity, if you will, of old truths, because old truths never go out of fashion. And with Linda Ewer, you heard about the ideas of two of the great economists. And if you look at her book, you'll see that there's a whole number of great economists whose ideas are still very powerful, very insightful, ideas that can still help us make sense of the world we're in and what we need to do in the future. The thing, though, unfortunately, is that to adapt an old phrase, you can't keep a bad idea down. Because amongst many of the old ideas that are still around are a whole lot of really bad ideas that are now actually having a resurgence. This day, today, is actually the birthday anniversary of one of the great, perhaps the greatest ever slayer of economic myths and bad economic thinking, Frédéric Bastiat. So hopefully later on we can all raise a toast to one of the truly great economists and economic journalists. But I'm afraid if Bastiat was alive today, he'd be pretty horrified at the way in which all kinds of economic fallacies and crazy ideas had suddenly gained purchase again and become popular once again. And it's not just economic ideas. Believe it or not, the idea that the Earth is actually flat has been gaining, a surprising degree of support these days. Famous rappers coming out in support of this idea. And I just discovered on YouTube the other day, to my great surprise, that actually Australia is a completely imaginary place, which has been made up by the round world conspiracy. And all those guys that you meet in bars around Earl's Court with, who've come from places like Melbourne or Sydney, they're not actually Australians, they're actors who have been paid to pretend that they come from a made-up country and adopt a daft accent. What I want to know is, why haven't I been offered that job? It sounds like a pretty cool job to me. But more seriously, there are all kinds of, like I say, completely crazy ideas which are making a revival. Ideas which in economic terms are flat earth theories. These are theories which are just as ridiculous as the idea that the earth is flat. These are theories which you would hope would have been as comprehensively disproved as the idea that the earth is flat. And yet they're making a comeback. For example, the case of free trade, the one with which Frédéric Bastiat was in fact most associated. Economists pretty much 100% agree that free trade is always and everywhere the best policy to follow. That allowing nations to pursue their comparative advantage without any check or interference through tariffs and the like is the way to maximize human utility, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of a whole range of other things as well, not least the lack of conflict between them. However, this idea, protectionism, the idea that the way to become wealthy is through impoverishing your own consumers, this idea has begun to actually gain ground. And of course, right now, we have across the Atlantic somebody who apparently has made it his life's mission, amongst other things, to give us a kind of idiot's guide to all the fallacies that can possibly be thought of in connection with trade policy. I'm speaking, of course, of the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Not only has he imposed tariffs on a whole range of goods from other countries, and then been very surprised when one of the United States' major manufacturing corporations, Harley-Davidson, decides to move its manufacturing facilities out of the United States to avoid the problems caused by tariffs being imposed on countries which are its major market. He's also constantly urging other countries to undermine the whole international trade order, which is not perfect, but which is certainly better than the kind of thing that he seems to hanker for. And amongst other things, he's complaining constantly about the trade policy of China. Well, let's say, for the sake of argument, that he's right, and that the Chinese government is indeed subsidizing manufacturers and then selling them to Western consumers at a below production cost. Just ask yourself, as you should do if you think about this as an economist, who is gaining and who is losing from that kind of policy and deal? The people who are gaining, quite clearly, are American consumers who are getting manufactured goods at a cost below the cost of their production. The people who are being screwed over majorly and massively are Chinese consumers who are being taxed in order to subsidize this export and therefore having their living standards reduce, and who, to the extent that the Chinese do not allow imports, according to Trump, are being barred from buying cheaper products from outside their own country. So essentially, if we grant what Trump says is true, then what is going on is a massive transfer of wealth from Chinese consumers to American consumers. If you're President of the United States, that doesn't sound like a problem to me. However, at this point, Donald Trump decides that he is going to become the champion of the Chinese consumer. And what he has done is to suggest a whole series of policies, the result of which will be basically to make Americans poorer, to injure their economic well-being, and if you follow the strict theory, actually enrich Chinese consumers. The problem, of course, is that it won't even do that, because what we are talking about here is a policy which is harmful for everybody, apart from small, select, vested interests of one kind or another. And it's easy to sort of laugh and mock the economic illiteracy of the Trump administration in this regard, but we should actually take this more seriously. Because one of the reasons why Frederick Bastiat and many other people were so strongly in favor of free trade was not just because it was the way to actually organize economic affairs most efficiently so as to maximize consumer utility. It's because free, peaceful trade and exchange relations with people in other parts of the world that go across geopolitical borders are one of the ways in which the world becomes more tightly bound together and more peaceful. By contrast, protectionism, the deliberate putting of barriers between those free exchange relations, is and historically always has been one of the things that has led to geopolitical tensions and ultimately, in many cases, wars. So this is the kind of thing that we should be actually seriously alarmed about, and not just for purely monetary economic reasons. The language of trade wars is often used, and you might think this is one of those cases of rhetorical exaggeration. But actually, in this case, the language of war is quite appropriate, and we should all be alarmed. The last time we had a major turn towards protectionism and the abandonment of free trade and international relations was at the end of the 19th century, after Germany under Bismarck abandoned free trade in 1878. And that had ultimately catastrophic and disastrous consequences because it played a major part in the growing great power and imperial tensions that led to the Great War of 1914-1918. Then, of course, as we all know, the move towards even more stringent protectionism in the 1930s was responsible for the virtual collapse of the world economy. But enough of that, how about closer to home? Because we can have lots of fun mocking the idiocies of the American government's trade policy, but we should not get too far ahead of ourselves, because I'm afraid there are plenty of examples of crazy flat earth economic policies coming to light on both sides of the political spectrum here in the UK. And the real problem, in fact, as I'll say in a moment, is that the phenomenon of what you might call economic flat earthism, which I'm about to describe to you, is not confined to one side of the political argument. What we're seeing is something that affects both sides. So on the one side, we've got what appears to be the nation's favourite uncle, Jeremy Corbyn, the man in the cardigan. What I'm about to say about Jeremy Corbyn, by the way, I think you need to make a distinction between Jeremy Corbyn himself and some of his close advisors, notably the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, who is, I think, a very able man, but therefore also a very dangerous one, and many of his followers. I think that they aren't quite on the same page economically, and although this hasn't become obvious yet. What Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell are is good, old-fashioned, state-controlled socialists. Jeremy Corbyn was elected to Parliament in 1983 on the Labour manifesto, which the late General Kaufman described as the longest suicide note in history. And he has never disavowed the contents of that manifesto and has in fact remained, to his credit I suppose in some ways, consistently loyal to the principles of that manifesto throughout his entire career in Parliament. That, by the way, is why I suspect very strongly that in the privacy of the voting booth he voted leave, given that one of the central planks of that manifesto was for Britain to withdraw from the EEC, as it was then called. So what does he believe in? Several of the things we have. Well, we know he believes in widespread nationalisation of public ownership. Not only the kind of things which I'm afraid do attract a lot of popular support, such as public ownership of the railways and the major utilities, the water and electricity and gas utilities, he's also in favour of compulsory public ownership of what are called key sectors of the British economy, or of compulsory planning agreements with large corporations, which would effectively make them agents of state economic policy rather than free agents pursuing their own strategies to achieve as high a return on their investment as they can. In other words, he believes in a planned economy, an economy in which the free economic exchange of private individuals, whether corporate or individual, is done away with and replaced by control by a plan put down from the top. The evidence, of course, of the history of the last 150 years, actually, is that this is a route to economic penury and disaster, because, quite simply, all the planners, if you will, the people who then control the investment decisions and the other decisions of industry, do not have the knowledge or the information that they would need to make rational decisions. It's often thought that planning and a planned economy is somehow a rational alternative to the chaos of the market. But in fact, the opposite is the case. As Ludwig von Mises said, it's planned chaos and economic irrationality, because what you have to work on is the random guesses of people who quite honestly do not know what they're doing. And that's not because they are willfully or deliberately ignorant. It's because it is impossible for them to know what they're doing, because the knowledge that they would need to have in order to know what they're doing is not available or accessible to them. And it's theoretically impossible that it ever would be. He's in favour also, and is on the record as being in favour of systematic interference in the price structure. This is actually worse than public ownership. If you have an economy in which public ownership is widespread, it will work less well than a privately owned economy, but it will still get by, it will still survive. But actually, if you had an economy where everything was privately owned, but prices were strictly controlled, the whole economy would collapse. If you doubt me, I've just got one word for you: Venezuela. That is why the Venezuelan economy is on the verge of total collapse and has basically impoverished an entire nation. It's not so much because the administration there has taken things like the oil company into public ownership, it's because they've imposed incredibly rigid and strict price controls, which in many cases involve things being sold only at a price which is below the cost of production. Given this, of course, nobody is making it. What a surprise. Who would have thought that would happen? But apparently, the people in Venezuela who do these kind of things, the current government of Maduro and his predecessor, Chavez, this didn't occur to them. Now, to be fair to him, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn would actually go as far as the government in Venezuela, although he's on the record as being a great admirer of that country's government and its policies. But on the other hand, price controls anywhere and everywhere have always had the most disastrous effects. As I say, much, much worse than straightforward nationalisation. If I had to choose between two bad alternatives, I would always take public ownership and nationalisation over price control. Price control is much more insidious and much more damaging. One of the things he favours is rent control. Rent control, well, I want to remember seeing a photograph, a big poster, and it had two utterly devastated, wasted urban landscapes. And underneath one of them it said Dresden 1945. The other said the Bronx 1975. And the caption underneath it said, "Area bombing, rent control, two ways to destroy a great city." And that is not an exaggeration. Rent control is one of the most effective ways known of destroying the urban environment, of giving people incentives to actually burn down their property in the extreme case, rather than keep it in good shape. Its effect everywhere is to reduce access to housing and other forms of accommodation, to enrich the people who happen to be fortunate enough to have rent-controlled apartments or houses when the controls are introduced, and to impoverish all those who would like to have access to accommodation in the future. As you know, who the people who have them are, they're the people who appear on US sitcoms, because apparently they all somehow manage to have rent-controlled apartments in New York and not work. That's only one of many examples. He's also in favour of a maximum wage, he let us know the other day. In other words, he's in favour of a system in which nobody can earn more than a certain amount, and the economically naive have welcomed this kind of radical egalitarianism. The effect of that would be to totally destroy the labour market. It would also mean that lots and lots of very talented people in a whole range of occupations would not work in the UK anymore, but would go elsewhere. And this would impoverish our country more than almost anything else that people could do, actually, in the world in which we now live. Fortunately, most of his colleagues in the Labour Party, including, I have to say, John McDonnell, were smart enough to know that this was a disastrous idea, and it was hastily shoved back under the mattress. But this tells us something about his instincts. He's also in favour of another idea which has been gaining a lot of support, the idea that we should have aggressive taxation. Now, what I want to say about that is that you can be against taxation, obviously on the grounds that it imposes a deadweight loss, that it makes the economy less productive, that it distorts the allocation of resources. But above and beyond that, you should be against the state having and controlling a very large part, or even worse, the majority of the national income. Because essentially, you can divide the national income, the totality of economic exchange, into two areas. One is the area where private choice rules. You decide what you spend your money on. You decide, having made that decision, to give your money to other people in free exchange. The other part of the economy, the bit that is government spending, which is currently just below 50% of the total economy, is the area where you do not make those decisions personally. That is the sphere of collective public or political choice. And so what Jeremy Corbyn is advocating is that personal private choice should be reduced and that collective political choice should be expanded. As somebody who believes in individualism and personal autonomy, I think that is utterly and totally the wrong way to go. But that is the thing to realise. And the assumption, the naive assumption, is that the area of political choice is one where somehow everybody chooses and everyone decides. In reality, the mechanisms that are involved are always such that that area of collective choice is one where elites and small cabals decide what is done and what is chosen, not individuals. And that is why, in fact, societies in which the state does control the great majority of spending and decisions of that kind is one dominated by a small and narrow oligarchy. So these are all, if you like, areas, if you like, of Jeremy Corbyn's ideas which are apparently amazingly popular with certain people, to judge by the reception he got at the Glastonbury Pop Festival last year. But on the other hand, I have to say things are no better on the other side of the aisle. Because with Theresa May, you have ideas which are of a different kind and a different flavour, but in my view equally wrong and just as dangerous. They are a slightly different variety of the same genus of economic flat earthism. I knew that there was something distinctly dodgy when, just after she became Prime Minister, she came out and gave a talk in Number 10, and the only past politician that she gave a name check to and sort of held up as one of her mentors, somebody she admired, was the Birmingham Tory politician, well, formerly Liberal, latterly Tory politician from the late 19th, early 20th century, Joseph Chamberlain. For me, as a historian, Joe Chamberlain is my least favourite British politician ever. This is a man whose great achievement was to cause a catastrophic split in one party, the Liberal Party, when he was a young man, and in the process bugger up our chances of peacefully solving the Irish problem. And then later on in life cause an equally catastrophic split in the Tory Party and lead that party to its greatest ever electoral defeat. What was it that Chamberlain wanted? The kind of things that Theresa May thinks are policies we should emulate. He wanted a policy of imperialism, militarism, renewed protection and high tariffs, used to fund an extensive welfare state and an active and interventionist role for government in industry. So basically you have imperialism, militarism, protectionism, and government intervention in the economy combined with paternalistic state welfarism. What on earth is there to like in any of that? Now, you may say, oh, this is just window dressing. This is just because Theresa May's guru at the time, now departed, Nick Timothy, is from Birmingham and is a fan of Joseph Chamberlain. But actually, the kind of speeches she has made and some of the kind of policy suggestions that are coming out of the government suggest that, in fact, she is still very much on that kind of trail. So, for example, we have the idea that we should have a national industrial strategy. This is the idea that the government should leave assets in private hands, but should second guess or even direct the investors, the owners of those private assets, to do what they, the politicians, think is best. Not that unlike Jeremy Corbyn's ideas, actually, but without the direct government ownership. The idea is that the government should decide that as a kind of collective enterprise, we are going as a country to specialize in certain areas, and in those areas we are going to have national champions, firms that are favored, given tax breaks, given encouragement by the state, maybe given state-sponsored investment or low-interest loans in order to invest. The idea, in other words, is that, again, we engage in a state-led project, very similar, as I said, to Jeremy Corbyn's idea, but without the state ownership. This implies, again, that the politicians, the people in the Treasury or the people in the Cabinet, know better than the collective decision-making of consumers where we should be putting the money. The examples that are always pointed to are, for example, Japan or latterly Germany, but in fact, there are as many cases where, in those two countries, where you can see how this whole strategy has not worked. Japan, for example, which was the favorite poster boy for this kind of strategy for many years, has had several attempts to create a worldwide pharmaceutical company because they think that's one of the areas they need to have a national champion in. What they've done is to waste literally hundreds of billions, probably close to over $1 trillion yen on doing this, and had no effect whatever. That's an enormous waste of resources. The evidence, again, is overwhelming that politicians simply do not have the knowledge or the capacity to be able to plan some kind of national industrial strategy. What this actually is an excuse for favouring privileged vested interests and people with political clout and pull at the expense of consumers. She's also, as we heard, famously promised, before she became Prime Minister even, to create a hostile environment for immigrants. If you are a UK resident, you may not notice what this is doing or the effect it is having, at least not yet. If you, however, hear you're living in this country on a visa, you will have found the effect of this already. A friend of mine, for example, who is living in this country on a visa at the moment, has found that because of the way the policy has changed, she has been unable to leave the country to attend academic events. A whole number of things that she wanted to do, she's been unable to do because she is not sure that if she leaves the country, she will be allowed back in because of the unwelcoming or hostile environment that Theresa May's government has created. We have the idea constantly put forward at the moment that not only should we have more restrictive controls on who comes into the country, but also that to the extent we do allow people in, this should be done on the basis of something like a points system, where the government allocates points to people on the basis of whether or not they have certain kinds of qualifications. This, again, is the most incredible hubris. It implies that the government knows what kind of people employers want, that it has knowledge not available to anybody else as to how the economy as a whole is working, what sort of qualified people it needs, what kind of people it doesn't need. There's also very often the kind of underlying notion that what we really need is lots of people who are STEM graduates and things of that sort. We don't want any of those people who will do dirty but necessary jobs for less wages than the locals will do it, thank you very much. Actually, all of the evidence is that it's precisely people like that the British economy does need most. Not only that, but control on migration will have, again, very, very damaging effects for the British economy as a whole. All of the evidence from the Treasury and elsewhere suggests that the level of immigration that we experienced in the years leading up to 2008, and indeed for several years after that, actually significantly boosted the growth of GDP in this country. But it isn't simply, again, a matter of economic growth. Restricting people's freedom to move within geopolitical borders or across geopolitical borders is always and everywhere a severe restriction on the liberties and freedoms, not only of the people who want to move, but crucially of the people who live within those geopolitical borders, who want to interact with, employ, or buy services from the people who want to move across the borders. You cannot control the borders of any part of the world without controlling the people who live within those borders. That is unavoidable. It also involves going down very dangerous roads in which you define who is or who is not a proper inhabitant of a particular part of the world. But once again, the underlying phenomenon is hubris, as I say, and an assumption of knowledge and capacity that people do not have. We also have, at the moment, a developing policy on housing, coming from Theresa May and the government. Now here we have a severe problem. There's no doubt that housing policy in the UK is one of the UK's great public policy disasters. Probably, in fact, the biggest public policy disaster cumulatively that we have had since World War II. It's got a few competitors, like our exchange rate policy for many years, but undoubtedly I think at the moment and over the longer period it's the worst public policy area we've got. So it's a real problem. But in a way, we know, and increasingly people across the political spectrum know, what we need to do is to relax the supply side controls so that we actually build more housing stock in places where people want to have houses, and that we also control or regulate things like the housing market, the taxation of housing and things of that sort, to make sure that demand is more controllable and not out of control in certain places as it is at the moment. But in fact, no, what is the government solution? The solution the government is increasingly moving to is that actually the state should build enormous amounts of houses out of the public purse, because apparently it will know better than anyone else where those houses should be built and how they should be built and all the rest of it. So we are going to produce a really bad top-down state-driven solution to a genuine public problem. So the point is that with both of the sides of British politics, we have a whole lot of completely misguided policies. Now, what do they have in common? Because I argue that although these things come in a different flavour, what we have is ultimately a single phenomenon. And there are two things to it. The first is simply ignoring fundamental economic understandings, the limitations of supply, for example, the fact that we live in a world of scarce resources, the fact that you always have to make trade-offs, the kind of elementary economic truths that Frederick Bastiat so memorably set forward. Above all, there's ignoring the fact of the limitations of human knowledge, the fact that we live in a world where nobody can, even in theory, have the kind of knowledge that is necessary for planning the affairs of large numbers of people, or even, for that matter, small numbers of people, and in which, therefore, we have to allow the spontaneous social processes to aggregate the information that we have in a useful way. But there's also something else. What both of these approaches embody, and the same is true very much of the policy of the Trump administration, is collectivism. What we are seeing is a revival of collectivism and a move against individualism. What we have between Corbyn and May, I would put to you, is simply a competition between two forms and varieties of coercive collectivism. National, traditionalist, conservative collectivism in the pace increasingly of the Conservative Party in the May administration, socialist, leftist collectivism in the case of the Labour Party. But in both cases, what is being emphasised is collectivism, the authority of the collective over the individual, the subordination of individual goals, individual life plans, individual decisions to collective decisions undertaken through the political process. The only real difference is the question of how the collective is defined. So, to conclude, what do we do? Well, we face challenges, just like Frederick Bastiat did all those years ago in the 19th century. We have to explain to and educate the public and the policymakers in economic reality. We have to basically show how the problems and challenges that we undoubtedly face, the problems of, for example, the totally dysfunctional British housing market, the problems of helping the people who are on the losing end of trade flows or innovation, making sure that the transitional costs of innovation and trade, which benefits everybody, are dealt with as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Dealing with the challenge of highly increasing differential equality. Jamie made the case that we should be quite relaxed about that and worry much more about poverty, and I agree. But at the same time, there is undoubtedly a social challenge, I think, for us all to face in the way in which at the moment the labour market is favouring certain kinds of people and not giving much benefit in ways to the other. So these are all challenges that we need to address. But what we need to do is to address them in ways that do not violate economic common sense. Above all, though, what we need to do, I think, is to reassert the principle of individual liberty, individual autonomy and self-determination, and uphold that principle against the tribalists and the collectivists of both the left and the right, who are on the rise all over the world at the moment. And that's what I think we all need to do going forward. So thank you very much.